Thanks everyone for joining us after school when I know everyone's really tired, but I think we're gonna really enjoy listening to Susan and Berkeley share with us. This is our Claim Evidence Reasoning webcast, and we're joined by Susan Holveck, who's Science Program Administrator for Portland Public Schools, and Berkeley Gadbaw, who is a middle school science teacher at Catlin Gabel. And we're so grateful to them for joining us. They also provided a link here if you're interested in accessing the slides. You can type that link in. Also, just so you know, we will provide all of this on our website afterwards, so don't feel like you have to hurry to get that link right now. It'll be available on our webcast archives page as well later.
I also just put a link in the chat so people could just click on that.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. That's also much easier. Thank you, Susan. So just a quick introduction to Zoom for, I think we have some folks who are joining us for the first time. Everybody's muted right now. We just find that really helps with background noise to have everyone come in muted. So just know that if you want to speak out and ask a question, you'll need to unmute yourself first. So this is what the icon looks like in Zoom to unmute yourself. But we do ask just to stay muted the rest of the time. Again, just so that the recording comes out and we can all hear the presenter as well. Another option is you can use the chat, which we'll talk about in a second. And I see many of us have our cameras on, which is great. If you have a device that allows you to have your camera on, we ask that you turn it on so we can all see you and get to know our colleagues across Oregon and beyond, and use this as a chance to build some community with science teachers everywhere. So thank you all for having your cameras on. I know sometimes people have laptops without cameras, that's fine, but if you can, we love to see you. And I don't think we'll need to share screens today, but just so you know, this button allows you to share what's on your screen with the other people that are either in the session or in your breakout room, but you probably won't need that today. And the chat is a great way to ask questions. If you don't feel like you want to call out your question, you can type it in there and I can try to catch it, or one of our facilitators will catch it and try to answer your question. And I think that's just about it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll turn it over to Berkeley and Susan.
Hi. Excellent. All right, I'm going to pull up my screen here and hopefully share. Let's try that. Here we go. So Susan, I just wanted to start by having you post your name, your district, institution, and the grade level that you work with into the chat box. And then we were also hoping that you might respond to the question that we wanted you to ponder there. And that is, what is the most challenging part of writing claim evidence and reasoning for your students? What is the most challenging part of that?
So it looks like we have a variety of levels of teachers from middle school, high school, elementary. Great. We hope we have something for all of you today.
I see one response here that says the most challenging is the reasoning piece of it. And we're hoping that we can address part of that today too. I think that you're not alone in that being the most challenging.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we're going to be sharing is also how you can incorporate the claim evidence reasoning in your class very frequently, and giving some suggestions for how to do that, because we think that the more students do this and the more supports and structures that we provide for students, the better they get at able to produce a good claim, evidence, and reasoning.
All right.
If you didn't get a chance to do that, as we move through the slide deck, please add in that information, because we will be looking at examples of student work later by grade level. So we need to know if you're K-5, middle, or high school to get you in the right group. So one of the things that, like, why would we want to do claim, evidence, reasoning? Well, first of all, in the 8 scientific and engineering practices, arguing from evidence is one of the practices that we need students to engage in. And in order for them to really be able to do this and to write conclusions using a CER methodology, they have to actually communicate information, and they have to analyze data. Usually it's data that they've taken. It could be numeric, it could be observational, and perhaps using some mathematics to computationally change or interact with that data. So these are where we're going to focus the practices in claim, evidence, reasoning, but it's also why we feel it's important that we are having students have multiple opportunities, because they are using these 4 science and engineering practices to create a claim, evidence, and reasoning.
So I wanted to just begin with this example of a claim, evidence, reasoning, because throughout the year, but especially when I begin the school year, I like to use everyday examples with students for with topics that they're familiar with. So this happens to be one that a student wrote last year about the Blazers, and student was arguing that the Portland Trail Blazers are going to win the Western Conference Finals. And so because he was really knowledgeable about basketball, when I asked why does he think that that's going to happen, he was very easily able to pull some stats that would support his answer, so, or his claim. So he talked about CJ's point average, and that they were they beat the Denver Nuggets before, and that one of the players was injured on the other team, so they might be off their game. And so from that, I was able to have the student reason out like why those statistics would be important. And so I just wanted to include this as an example to encourage us to not just limit the claim, evidence, reasoning to labs and maybe just topics within the classroom, within the immediate science classroom, but so students see this as a way to argue a point and communicate from evidence in everyday conversation as well. And this especially helped with the reasoning portion of an argument, because students who know a particular subject, like in this case, basketball, really well, can explain why a particular stat or piece of information is really important to the bigger picture of a basketball game. And so they were able to argue things like, for that second point, that they were the underdogs, but they beat the Nuggets, that usually a team that has momentum going into the finals has a better chance of winning. So I just wanted to include that as an example before we begin looking at more science-specific ones.
So we were brainstorming what other kinds of everyday topics you might be able to use in your classroom. And, you know, a claim is really like the answer to the question that you have been testing. And what we were wondering was what claims you might be using as examples with your students that are common experiences. Are any of you introducing claim, evidence, and reasoning in a similar vein with a common topic? And if you want to unmute and share, we'd love it, or type in the chat. That would be great too. And if you aren't using it, that's okay. So I see a couple of things in the chat, and some are using it only on science. But what we're finding, or what we found in Beaverton, where I used to work, that especially in middle school, because I was a middle school teacher, that when the entire team was using a common format similar to the one that we just shared with Berkeley's example, and we'll provide a link to that one, and students were doing that across multiple subjects, that was actually hugely beneficial when, especially in social studies, math, and science, we're kind of teaching them the same process.
I see a note there about, could students do it on any topic that they're interested in? And I just wanted to add that I think it's very valuable for kids to write a claim evidence reasoning about topics that they are knowledgeable about. And I put in some silly examples that I use with kids all of the time, but when I'm sitting one-on-one with a student who's struggling with this idea, if I can pull up a topic that they're interested in, if they're a gamer or have another hobby, and we talk about evidence for why X is the best video game out there, they very easily understand evidence and reasoning. So I just want to plant that seed.
And I saw one teacher was talking about doing a common inquiry lab where students had to make a claim, and I think it was dissolving a Skittle and different kinds of liquids. And that could also be another way to introduce, when students have a common experience and you walk them through that process, it's very valuable. We're finding that we have to actually teach the entire process and give kids multiple opportunities for this to become something that is natural for students to be able to do.
Thank you. All right, you can keep adding examples in there. Yeah, high school start time should be later. That's a great one. I can see kids are very excited about that. So
thank you for sharing, everybody.
Thank you. So we just wanted to start with a common experience ourselves and to look at an example together to sort of re-examine or refresh for ourselves the idea of what exactly a claim, what an evidence, and what is reasoning is. And so we're going to start with an example and just watch a short video. And I'm going to mute it because there's not, I don't think we need the sound. Whoops. Sorry, let's try that again. Let's see if we can get it to play. And just observe it's about a minute long, and just sort of observe these two mini demonstrations. And then the question that we are talking about perhaps in this example is air matter? Is air matter? And so if you missed the beginning, there were just two balloons, both filled with air. And now this. And then there's a second part, and we'll pull evidence from this in a moment. All right, so if we were to look at again what exactly claim evidence reasoning are, and what we would see is that the claim is again something that's answering our scientific question or the question we're investigating, and then we would have evidence, and this can come from multiple sources, but from for this particular example, it's going to come from the video, and perhaps that's data that students have collected as well. And then for the reasoning, we want that to include a rule or scientific principle that describes why the evidence supports the claim. So a student explanation might include something like the following: that air is matter, and that when the air is let out of the blue balloon, it went further up on the straw balance compared to the pink balloon, which means it was lighter or weighed less. And the student might write, you can also see it takes up less space. And then as we pumped more air into the ball, there was more mass. The mass started at 84.6 grams and ended at 85.1 grams as evidence. Whoops. And then for our reasoning, it might sound something like air is made of matter because when we removed the air in the balloon, it weighed less and got smaller. All matter has to have mass and volume. This shows that air has mass and volume, both of the characteristics of matter. And as we saw in our chat at the very beginning, it's usually the reasoning that students struggle with the most. So we're hoping to provide some techniques to help with that as well. So there are 4 separate approaches we're going to sort of take today that we're going to share to make claim evidence and reasoning more of a routine in the classroom. And because really it's only with practice and exposure that students can get comfortable with building this as a skill, both in written and in speaking. And we're going to hope to share a couple ways that you can formatively assess students and then also track their growth over time. And so we wanted to start with a few tools to scaffold classroom conversations so that students are familiar with this language. So this is a STEM teaching tool that I've used in many of my classes, or with all of my classes, and I like to have these tools available at all times for students. So I know some teachers have it out only when only for a particular activity. I almost always have these available for students at any time, kind of like I would keep rulers handy or something else that we might need in a materials bucket. And I just sort of put them in little laminated sheets so that they're available. But if we look at the language of this, students, it really tries to get at students using evidence and reasoning. And so here's a couple examples, or a couple I just want to highlight. Evidence that supports my argument is blank. And then I think this is supporting evidence because. And then this one I love because it's sort of getting at the reasoning. I think this relates to the scientific idea of, where students can kind of zoom out and say this is relating to what we had talked about previously with matter having volume or something like that. And then on the listening side, there's also some phrases that I encourage students to use. I heard you say blank. What evidence is that based on? And I really try to use these, especially at the beginning of the year, to require students when we're having a class conversation to use them, which might sound a little bit strange, but I found that once that routine is established, kids start to do it on their own. And here's another one. You described blank. Do you have any ideas why that happens? So getting kids to get at some of the reasoning ideas for what other information do they know as a person and as a scientist that might help explain what they're seeing. This is sort of a different way to encourage talking in a classroom. And so this is an example of what might be on my whiteboard. Almost on a daily basis, I have some sort of prompts up there in addition to just instructions. So it might be an opener that they're writing about, but then there's always a prompt to talk. And in those quotes or in the sentence frames that I provide for students, I'm trying to usually get at, again, evidence and reasoning. So for example, here it would say the pattern that we saw in our table or graph is blank. And I'm wanting kids to refer back to specific evidence. And I like to sort of show this as an example, not because, I guess just to say that to do this as much as possible in your classroom, where you're providing students that the language to share their ideas, but using evidence and reasoning, or I guess as they are talking, will get them more comfortable with it. So they are a bit more familiar with it. And this particular one was an example from a jigsaw activity I did. So students could just look up on the board and had a role for speaking, and then had a role as a listener as well. So over on this side, when it's your turn to listen, you know, you're taking notes, but then you're also required to ask a clarifying question at the end. And again, these aren't magical. I change them every day, or I write sentence frames all the time in order for kids just to become familiar with that evidence and reasoning piece and get them talking science. So, all right, here I just wanted to show a short video of what this might look like in my classroom, and I'm gonna mute it. It does not have great sound anyway, and just talk a tiny bit. But this was from my classroom in Beaverton School District, and students had been just studying basic particles of matter and had just been examining smells and how smells are a gas and their molecular formulas. And so in this case, this student's just reading from a script, and all of the students had script. So he was not alone, but definitely helped for him to be able to join the conversation and explain his thinking. And then they would pass the script around. And in this video, she hands him the script because he's sort of getting off task. And so she wanted him to go back to explaining the lab that he was doing. And so she hands him that script to get him back on track. And then again, the same thing here, where for all students, the scripts are sort of pieces to build confidence and allow them to enter conversations with surrounding claim evidence and reasoning.
I just want to interject one thing, Berkeley, because we had a question in the chat. Can you use the CER?
We wanted to pause and see if you have questions or thoughts or comments so far. And we can take those, you know, verbally or written into the chat as well.
One of the teachers put into the chat that could you use the CER for models? And in your video, Berkeley, I saw that students did have models of the gases that they were smelling, and I could see some particles and arrows. And so I want to say, yes, use these with models and in conjunction with models and explanations. And what we see happening is that if you're using the NGSS format of anchoring phenomenon, and students are learning through the unit and creating explanations for that, and getting more accurate and sophisticated in their ability to answer that through the unit, there's a point for CERs at the beginning, the middle, and the end minimally. But also, as Berkeley was saying, even just practicing the skill for skill itself, like as an opener, like providing a data table, or having students relate it, you know, through another lab. It may not be on the same topic, but it's related. And so I don't know, Berkeley, if you have anything else to add on to how you intersperse this with modeling, with phenomenon in your classroom.
Sure, I would, yeah, I would say absolutely. Sometimes what I try to do is envision, like, if I were to listen to a student explain their model, what would be like my dream like, what would I want it to sound like? And then I sort of scaffold that back. So it would depend on the model, but I absolutely could see having a template for, you know, making a claim, depending on what question you were trying to get at, and whether you were using a whiteboard or looking at something, and then having a prompt to say, how do you see that, or what is your evidence, or point to the data on your whiteboard that would show that. Or so I absolutely could see using this to explain a model or a demonstration. That's how I'm interpreting your question. So
Yeah.
Good. Any others? Should we keep going?
Yep.
Okay.
If you have questions, please put them in the chat. I'm trying to monitor that. So.
Okay. The second way, or another way of building this skill of arguing from evidence and reasoning, arguing a claim from evidence and reasoning, is to provide tools to formatively assess students. And so we wanted to share 2 of those tools. And one is just for how to listen for students having evidence and reasoning in their discussions, and a way to track that and have some data data on how students are understanding that in their spoken language. And then also to talk a little bit about a tool called Go Formative that allows you to provide timely and consistent feedback for students. Whoops. So this tool is one I've used before just to monitor a whole class conversation, and to document when kids are speaking and whether they're building on each other's ideas and listening to each other. And I'm very explicit with kids. I'll even show them this, that, you know, the idea is we're building a culture of listening to each other. And so we're listening to how we back up our ideas with evidence, and how we can build on each other's ideas, and how we're asking questions. And then I build that routine from the beginning of the year. So I try to have a 10-minute conversation without my voice, where students, maybe I've given them a prompt ahead of time to prepare the night before, or or they have some data that we're going to talk about as a class. And then I just track a conversation using this. So I just wanted to show one of my examples, because just to show how messy that gets very quickly. But I just try to track when students are sharing a new idea with evidence. And so, or when they're building on each other's, or when they're summarizing or asking other questions. And this is just a lovely way for me to have a bit more data on which students are building that into their vocabulary and as a practice as a scientist. The second, whoops, I'm not sure what happened there. Oh, that's to the link. Let's see. Okay. This video is just going to play in the background again while I talk just a tiny bit. But Go Formative is a tool that allows for, it's a website, and students can join. It's linked to Google Classroom. And I know this is really tiny, so I'm just going to sort of attempt to verbally tell you what is happening on the screen. But as students type in a response, so the prompt is, how would you describe in your own words what happens to the atoms in the reaction? But it could have been any sort of response. I can see each student's response popping up, and then give them real feedback in the moment. So if a student's on track, I can simply respond, or if there's a multiple choice question, I can see which kids are struggling with that and sort of prompt them to reread, or offer them feedback, or ask them a question. And so there's a moment up here where I redirect a student, but this website is very slick in getting students to, you can display kids' responses without their names or with their names, and they can see examples of each other's work in real time. And then it's very easy for kids to edit their responses and go back. So I'm gonna pause the video part, but I wanna just show you some examples using Go Formative and how it might change your students' written responses. And this particular assignment, we were talking about, kids had different graphs, And the prompt on Go Formative was using your graph, write one piece of evidence to support the claim. And we were talking about climate change. Do we have evidence that the temperature has changed over time? And so originally this student responded with this response. They said, over the years, the temperature anomaly has been steadily rising. That was their evidence. And after our discussion, or after they saw how other kids were writing, and we talked about the importance of including numbers or what that does to a sentence, within a matter of minutes, they had responded to the same prompt. So they basically just deleted their previous sentence and changed it to be this second example. So over the years, the temperature anomaly has been steadily rising. Since 1880, in January, the temperature anomaly has risen by 2 degrees. So we've been working on, as a class, talking about how numbers shift or adds or can strengthen evidence in a claim. And so I'll just show a couple more. Again, here's a very general my graph that was given to me, which is often how middle schoolers start their evidence, shows temperature and how it's gotten higher over time, and then was able to modify that after our class discussion to include more quantitative data as evidence. And then one final example. Here was a third student. When the CO2 concentration increases, so does the evidence. And then after reading others and talking about what makes evidence stronger. And I oftentimes use Go Formative to tell students that we're all working on becoming stronger writers and stronger scientists. And so everybody's revising theirs. It doesn't matter, even no matter what their starting point was, we're all making revisions based on our discussion. And so just had changed it again to providing a bit more powerful data in their second response.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
So one of the things that I've really learned in working with Berkeley and with teachers in the districts where I've been in Portland and Beaverton is that scaffolding is really essential to the success of students being able to make increasingly better claim evidence reasoning. And I think Berkeley just gave a great example where you're taking a piece of data and students are trying it once and then you're having a discussion and they're trying it again. So we wanted to share some of the scaffolds that that Berkeley uses and that teachers use in our districts to help students with this. And we want you to realize that you need to be doing it multiple times in a unit, but then also across the whole year. So that gradual release of student support, although it's still always there, can happen as you practice and kids get more confident and are able to do it more independently. And our hope is that if we are all doing this, that when they enter the grade the following year, that they are, working a little bit higher than they were the year before, and we're all working as a team. And that's the kind of the vision of the NGSS, and that each year students will be able to do more. But even in high school, we need to be using these frameworks and framing and outlines and supports to help students be successful. So this is one of the frames, write your explanation, that we use, and we're breaking it up into the 3 parts: the claim, the evidence, and the reasoning. Now, in K2, we're not really asking students to do the reasoning part, but beginning in grades 3 and above, we would like students to start adding the reasoning component. But providing those sentence frames, and I know in Portland Public we've been writing common assessments for grades 6 through 12 for science, and we are including on the assessment the sentence frames for students to be able to do this. So we we really feel that that's important for students to be able to be successful. This is a tool that was developed in Beaverton. A 7th grade teacher created this, and it's one that we really like. And you saw in the beginning of our webinar that Berkeley had used this for her trailblazers, and often we'll have that piece of evidence like number 1, and then the reasoning will be right next to it. So they'll be like evidence, reasoning, evidence, reasoning, evidence, reasoning. And we're really asking for kids like 3 pieces of evidences and maybe 3 ways to make sense of that in a scientific manner. And then you can use this to develop the framework and then write a concluding paragraph afterwards in a paragraph form following this tool. And then figuring out, like, how do we know how well the students are doing? So this is a criteria checklist that I believe Berkeley put together of how students can self-check if their claim, evidence, and reasoning are meeting criteria. And I don't know if Berkeley, you want to talk a little bit more about that.
I took this, it's similar to a rubric. For me, it was just a simple, I just sort of simplified the rubric just to sort of must-haves and amazing. So it could be proficient or highly proficient, or depending on what your district or school does. But for students to have a checklist that they can use throughout the year, so that they're familiar with the expectations, and it can establish some patterns in terms of what they're doing each time. And actually this syncs closely with the resource we're going to share at the end, which is called the Data Nuggets. And so this is nothing new. It's just taking this and making it available to students so that they are owning their writing of claim, evidence, and reasoning a little bit more.
Sounds good. Well, I think we're ready to try the breakout groups.
Okay, I hope I got everybody in the right group. And if I didn't hear from you, I'm putting you in middle school just because it's in the middle. So hopefully it will be close to the grade that you work with. So, and some of you are going to stay in the main session instead of getting a breakout room invitation. And the reason for that is so we can get a recording of your conversation, because I think it's going to be really valuable. So you should see, many of you will see an invitation right now. So go ahead and click accept to go into your breakout room. And I will be joining elementary.
Hi, this is Berkeley. I'm in the middle school room. I can't see people, so I'm going to try to get that first. And hopefully that. So I see that I think we have 15 people. If you want to unmute yourself, you are welcome to at this stage. We're a smaller group now. I think there's 13 of us. And it seems like many of us teach middle school. So the purpose of this time is we get to look at some student samples. And for us, these are student samples where students are using some of the scaffolding tools that you were just shown. And so we just want to take a look at, I'll click on my screen. So I think that might be easiest we can kind of look at it together. And then the questions we want to think about are sort of, how is the tool enabling kids to engage with the data differently? I would love, we could have an open discussion about, are you using something similar? What else are you noticing about the student work, and what questions you have? So I will click on the student examples and give a tiny bit of background. And you're welcome to click on that link, or I could share that link if I knew how. Let's see if I can make this bigger. It's hard for me to tell if there's other people here. So are there other people here?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Good, thank you. I feel like I'm talking to a screen, so it's hard. I can't see pictures, but yeah, so if you can see my screen, the first couple examples and that are surrounding, we were looking at the change in a population or the shift in a population over time. So we were looking at the peppered moth, which is historically used as a case example for our case study for natural selection. And then there's a few other examples surrounding the same theme of natural selection, population shift, but it was about finches. And so you can kind of, or I'll scroll through, but feel free to pop in with anything you might notice, or again, how the tool is helping students, or what question, or any questions that you have. And I'll just scroll through. We'll look at student 1 to begin with. And I'll just sort of be quiet so everybody can read maybe, and then we can talk. So this was an ELL student who was struggling with writing, and this was towards the end of the year. And for me personally, having him pull in some statistics to back up what he was saying was huge. And so when I saw that, that was immediately one thing I was excited about. Do others use similar outlines or writing prompts for students writing claim evidence and reasoning?
I use this writing prompt, the same one, claim evidence and reasoning, for my students.
Okay. And do you have success with that, or places that you struggle with?
No, I haven't. It's easy to verbalize it and show them. It gives them a great visual. Right now they're doing it independently in the process of their research project. We have a big science fair coming up, and I focused on this kind of component where they identified a claim based off of their research paper that they did.
Mm-hmm.
And then now they're in the finding the evidence. Some students went into an experimental plan, while others are doing more of a model base, such as like plate tectonic movements, and showing how that is helping to shape the Earth's surface. So their evidence, I'm trying to figure out, how to help them with their evidence piece, and then it'll tie back into their reasoning. But we can get data, from other scientists and so forth, and that type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Which might be, a great place to start for having strong evidence would be probably from others, especially for something like that, where you might not be tracking earthquakes yourself, but can definitely have access to that.
Now, with the use of the claim evidence reasoning, how specific would you recommend students get with their claim? Like in this particular one, and I don't know if it makes a difference or not, but it doesn't really specifically address which moth's survival, or it's so for the claim, does it just need to be a simplified statement, and then whatever statement is made, then that is supported by the evidence, and then they draw their.
I think that's a wonderful question. So in this case, I was ecstatic that the student had a clear sentence that he was going to argue with data and had a reason or an idea behind why that might be happening. I'll scroll down, and this one's maybe a little bit harder to see. Let me see if here's one that's maybe easier. So you can see that this person, maybe it's not the most clearly articulated claim, but is much more layered in why they're seeing a change in the population.
Okay.
And they're saying as part of their claim, the first idea is how pollution affects the trees when they provide camouflage for the moths, and the second is dominant versus recessive. So this student, like if I were to be conferencing with them, we would have to work on really honing in on that claim. And I'm getting better about doing that with kids. And it helps me to use everyday examples, again, to try to illustrate that for them. So I can claim that candy is great, but I could also say Snickers is the best candy bar. And for them, they can hear the difference in why one would be easier to argue.
Okay.
So, yeah, so I think back to your question, it can really be, I don't think there's a right or wrong. I just think we want students to be
Making each word count.
yeah, and sort of what is their evidence supporting? Is it a specific population of moths that they're going to argue about, or are they just saying that pollution is affecting the moths? And in this case, pollution affected the moths both ways.
Yeah.
It preferenced one, and then after air quality standards changed, it shifted back to selecting for a different one. So they may have been thinking about that when they wrote them.
Great, thank you. That was
Yeah, I hope that answered that question. I'd love to hear what others think too. I'll scroll down just to keep us going. I like highlighting in the reasoning in this student's example how they're getting to, this was in a unit where we had just been studying genetics, and so they have a sentence in here, this happens because the typical allele is more common than the carbonaria allele. So they're at least pulling some of that bigger picture into their reasoning, as well as the change in lichen and camouflaging, able to protect themselves from predators. So those layers to reasoning and what bigger science concepts help back up our ideas or help us connect the evidence to the claim are really important. Any other things? I'll scroll down just to look at a different example for the finches. This one's easier to read maybe a little bit.
And Berkeley, just so you know, we're back.
Oh, okay.
We're back with you.
Okay, sorry, I don't know how long you've been there.
We just got back.
Okay. Let me jump back to here.
Berkeley, I'll say in the high school group, and maybe the other groups were also having the same discussion, is that teachers really are asking for tips or tricks of the trade for helping students understand the difference between the evidence and the reasoning, and that they're kind of giving the same information in both places. And I don't know how you approach that. Is it just practicing and explaining and then doing again and doing it one more time in a different context, or like, I don't know if you can share your insight.
So, yeah, I think the most effective things I have found are showing strong examples and weak examples. So kids can recognize the difference. And I can find and share some resources, but, or even you can write them yourselves, but if you can show students an example of of strong reasoning, of reasoning out evidence, they recognize that, even though they may not be able to do it yet. So, you know, if that was an area kids were struggling with, rather than having them write a whole conclusion, I might just say, we're going to focus on the reasoning part, and I'm giving you evidence from this lab, and, you know, tell me which of these three conclusions includes the best reasoning. And have kids talk about why that might be, or what they notice about those. And then I would say the other tip I try to give kids is to use scientific vocabulary. And again, that comes back to, I use everyday examples, I think, to try to get them to understand why that's important. Because if I'm going to explain, you know, why selling more tickets is an indicator that something is more popular. If my evidence for why the Nutcracker is the best ballet, I'm talking maybe with a ballet student, and they, my evidence for why the Nutcracker is the best ballet ever written, then I would pull data on ticket sales and how many books or versions there are as my evidence, and I would have to explain why ticket sales are an indicator that something is popular. And so I don't know if that makes sense, but that would be, again, the more times I can sort of reiterate that the reasoning part is zooming back and saying, as though somebody didn't know anything about that particular lab, and what concepts are you bringing in to understand that evidence, if that makes sense. What else? Did that help? I can't.
Any other questions that arose in your group to share with everyone else, or?
In the elementary group, I thought one interesting thing we talked about was it's not just the kids who need to learn it, but the teachers too, and how to support teachers to really understand the differences. And, you know, a lot of us weren't trained in how to do this type of writing. And so elementary teachers especially might need that support.
I would love to be able to share the last resource, just because for me it was one where I could go and see strong examples of claim evidence and reasoning. And it's written for all, you know, grade levels, or there's examples for different grade levels. I shouldn't say all. I'm not as familiar with elementary, but I know there's some options.
There are.
If that is an option, I would love to be able to share that.
Yes, let's do that.
Okay, so looking at this next tool really did shift my own understanding of claim evidence, and in particular the reasoning part, and being able to see examples of scientists, real authentic scientists' work, and then see how data could be analyzed to write strong claim evidence and reasoning argument. This was a great resource for me. So I also use it, and I listed it here as a tool to track growth over the entire school year. So sometimes we're looking for, how do we see big picture growth, or we have a growth goal in students, and this tool is amazing. So it's called Data Nuggets, and they're free public resources online, and they are scaffolded for different grade levels. So they have elementary, middle school, high school, above. And the more I use them, even though something might say it's an earlier level, it doesn't necessarily mean you couldn't use it for higher grades. So you really kind of can, I've looked at some of the elementary and used those at the middle school level. And I don't think they're necessarily exclusive, but this is sort of what's recommended. And then the other beautiful thing about this resource is that students, I guess they're scaffolded so that the data analysis piece can be something where the graph is already provided, or students can graph the entire thing, or you can just give them a handout with the axes labeled and the graphs already set up. And so what I thought we would do is just scroll through one. And so I'm going to go to the actual data nugget page. And oops, I'm going back 1 second. Sorry. And I'm going to do it on one that we're familiar with, or that I'm a bit more familiar with. So again, these are authentic stories and studies that scientists have conducted, and they're available for educators to, just for this skill in reading and then articulating claim, evidence, and reasoning. And so we're going to look at this example together. And this was a scientist doing some work in the Harvard forest. And I'm going to click on this student activity type C graph. And since I know time's running out, I'm just going to ramble about these for a second. But these are wonderful because there's rubrics available for you, and there's also answer keys. So when you're looking at, you're wanting an example, they're all available for you. So it starts, every single data nugget starts with the research background and some written work. And later, students can use this to write the reasoning portion of their argument or refer back to it. And so then it'll tell the story of the scientist and what data they're collecting, and then it will give actual data. And then students take this and plot it out on a graph. And then every data nugget follows the same basic format, which is make a claim that's answering the scientist's question. And in this case, the scientist's question is the Harvard forest a carbon source or a carbon sink? And how has the net ecosystem, NEE, changed over time? So that's talked about in that beginning bit. What evidence was used to write your claim? And so reference specific parts of the data table, and then explain your reasoning and why the reasoning supports your claim. And connect the data back to what we learned about photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition, and how that influences the carbon cycle in forests. And all of this reasoning piece does not have to come from work you're currently doing. Students are provided with enough information at the beginning of the data nugget to pull in reasoning from the article itself. So these can sort of be standalone. How are students doing on their reading comprehension? And then what does reasoning sound like here? And sometimes they're given hints to go back to the bigger ideas. So I know we're getting close to time, but I would really encourage you to check this out as a resource that's available to you. And as I said, there's rubrics available for that as well. What would you add, Susan, there?
We just love the data nuggets, and like Berkeley was saying, there is level 1 for elementary. I would say it's upper elementary, and for middle, this was a middle school. This is a level 3, so this is actually a high school. So level 2 is middle school, and then level 4 is for undergraduate. So there's all those levels, but even within each one, the reading is the same between the A, B, and C, but the only thing that's changing is the level of independence of the students doing the graphs. And it's the best source of practice for the claim evidence reasoning that we have come across. They're all primarily life science prompts. So if you're a chemistry teacher, it's a little bit harder, but what we really love about is that it's the actual data that the scientists have collected. So it's real science. There's information on the scientist and further links on the source page to learn more about the scientists and the work that they're doing, and other resource links. So it's tremendous and valuable resource. And
I know we don't have time, but if you want to look at the PowerPoint, there are links just for this particular example to see an answer key, how reasoning can sound. I know somebody was asking about that, so strong examples of reasoning. How are we doing?
I think we're at 5:30, so does anyone have any questions before we go? And then Leah, I don't know if you want to ask about the exit survey. And
Yeah, I put the link in the chat. So we would love to get your feedback. And that's also how I can be in touch with you with your certificate for attending for 1PDU. Oh, and I see a question about the link. Oh,
Just
Susan
put it in.
already got it.
Yeah.
Quick. So quick with the links. Thank you.
Yeah, and this will all be on the OSTA website.
Mm-hmm. So it's available to members on our webcast archive page. And if you fill out the exit survey, I will also put the link in the email that you'll get. So you'll be able to go find it.
We're so
Thanks.
glad that all of you joined us after you've worked all day with children, and that you took this opportunity for professional learning with us. And we really appreciate the conversations that we have and what we can learn from all the teachers in the region. It's awesome.
I want to shout out Sharon from Idaho. She's with the Idaho Science Teachers Association, and I love to see this working together.
We're all in this together, aren't we?
Yes. Thanks for joining us.
Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you.